There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some moles. So SNL has this thing where they have the 5 Timers Club, and I think the podcast, we're going to have to start having something of that nature because our guest here, just with me today, Steven's not on this one with me, but he's going to be doing all the back end work. We've had this individual on now. This is the 3rd time, so she's the first of the 3-Timer Club. You all know her from her awesome research. If you were at the International Wolf Symposium, she was talking about all the great new research and all the stuff that they're doing up in Yellowstone National Park. She's a research associate for over a decade with the Wolf Project. She is Kira Cassidy. Kira, great to see you again. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me again. I'm doing really well. And yeah, I like the SNL. I mean, it's kind of like, Tom Hanks was maybe one of the first to hit that 5 times. And so anytime I can, compare a visit to Tom Hanks, I'll definitely take it.
Yeah, you, Steve Martin. I mean, Tom Hanks. You're in rarefied air right there, Kira. That's not bad. And I mean, the reason that and it's so great, and thank you for being so open and coming on about this, because we actually spoke about this paper a little bit at the symposium that it was coming to fruition. You, Doug, Tom Gable, all the national parks worked on this. And just give everyone a little bit of a background about what this paper was, what it was like working with all the national parks, because I know that's a huge undertaking. What was it like just collaborating with all the different individuals at these different places?
Yeah, so the project was kind of, I would say, the brainchild of Doug Smith, who was my supervisor for years, just retired a couple months ago only. He's the senior author on this paper. And, it's probably something that he started thinking about pretty early in his career, human impacts on wolves, and thought about in different ways, probably for decades, really. And working for the national park, that kind of the Park Service mandate starts to come into play, and asking questions about our impacts on wolves in parks especially. And so Doug and I, when I started in this research position, had a few conversations about what a paper or an analysis on this impact might look like. And a lot of people have studied wolves at the population level. And so looking at how many wolves live in a certain area and how growth rate is impacted by humans. Overall, most of those studies have found that wolves are super resilient at the population metric. So a bunch of them can be killed by people, up to 30%. Some of the studies say even higher than that, maybe 40, 45% can be killed by people each year. And growth rate and population size isn't really affected, especially long-term. Within a year or two, population size is right back up to where it was originally. But my kind of interest, and maybe I kind of influenced Doug a little bit in this way in our time working together, has been on the pack. And my master's project with Dave Meach over a decade ago now focused on aggressive interactions between packs. So, how pack composition and pack size is so important to their life history. And we just kind of started to look more and more at the pack level instead of population level metrics only. And so the more we talked about this, we actually did a study with Denali and published that paper in 2015 on how visibility of wolves in the parks is affected by prior hunting seasons. And after doing that with Bridget Borg, that was finishing up her PhD. She's a biologist in Denali National Park and Preserve now. It was really great to work with her. And so then we started to have this conversation with Denali. She works really closely with a biologist named Matt Sorum from Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve. And he was on board. They have a bunch of amazing data on wolves going back decades there as well. And so with those two parks from Alaska, we started to have these conversations about pack level metrics. And it was a little bit of a throwback to some people may have heard of the biologist Gordon Haber. He was studying wolves in Denali and did a bunch of very similar to Rick McIntyre, where he would do a lot of observations and was seeing these lineages of wolves last generation after generation, and was really an advocate for preserving those lineages. And this was kind of bringing some of his ideas back, I think. As the years went by, we were organizing data, collecting data every year. Every year wolves are killed by people, die naturally, just keeping track of that. Packs form, packs dissolve. That kind of started to be the center of our research question, pack persistence, and how it's impacted by human-caused mortalities to the pack. So when they experience a human-caused mortality, or maybe more than one, what happens to the rest of the pack long-term? And in the last few years, we started talking to a few other parks, Grand Teton National Park and Voyageurs National Park. The biologists studying both of those places were also willing to share data and interested in the same types of research questions. And so all of a sudden we have 5 parks together. We have tons of data. It was when I started receiving it from all of the collaborating parks, I was pretty blown away. I mean, I'm working in Yellowstone. I'm already spoiled with how much long-term data I have access to. And to get, these big files sent from Denali and Yukon Charlie, decades worth. The Denali data went back to 1986, packs that formed and packs that dissolved since then, a bunch of wolf mortalities. And then I organized the data from the 5 parks in a way that made sense so that we could start to answer some of the research questions. And it was a big group. It's probably the biggest group I've ever worked with on a single paper like this. There are 13 people on the authors list from each of the parks, and then also Voyageurs Wolf Project, who did a lot of work in Voyageurs National Park for a number of years. And so they're associated with the University of Minnesota. That's Joe Bump, Tom Gable, and Austin Homkes. And then Steve Windells is the biologist from Voyageurs National Park, and he's been there a long time. I mined some of their data from the late 80s and early 90s, actually, because their data has kind of been, there was a very concentrated study for about 4 years, and then they picked it up again starting in about 2013. And the only handful of people I didn't mention by name were Grand Teton National Park biologists Sarah Dewey and John Stevenson, and their technician, Rebecca Thomas Kuzilik. And then from Yellowstone, it was me, Doug, and Dan Staler, who's the project biologist. And so that's all 13 of us. It was a pretty great project to work on. That's a lot of people, and it shockingly went pretty quickly. I think about a year and a half ago, I started organizing the data, analyzing it, started writing the manuscript. And then everybody was really great about, quick turnaround times and stuff. That's really important that it didn't sit there for, 6 months at a time, every draft. And then going through the peer review process can be, sometimes quick, sometimes slow. The journal we worked with was great, and we're really happy that it's out in the world now. It is open access. I was really happy about that.
That's
so people
good.
can read it for free and find it online.
That's great. I mean, do you find, and again, I always draw this parallel because you guys, it seems as though it doesn't shock me that it went as smoothly as it did, because you all work with wolves. And so you probably had that pack mentality of who's going to help out and do anything, and shifting papers around. So it doesn't shock me that it was done that quickly, but yeah, to have 13 authors and inputs there, it's extremely awesome that this was able to come together in that short amount of time. I mean, don't you feel that's just awesome that happened? Yeah,
I was really happy with it. I think it reminded me a little bit sometimes of, I think it's from Harry Potter. There was one of the professors who was really, I think she was I forget what professor she was, but she was kind of wacky, and 13 people were sitting at the table, and she said, the first one to stand up will die. And I always thought, if there's someone who, backs out of this paper or something, then it's all going to fall apart because that's the 13th person. But
Right.
everybody was on board. I was really happy. Hopefully we'll be able to work together in the future on other projects, kind of, springboarding off of this first one. And I think it's really powerful to have so many people working together, so many national parks, especially ones that people visit. There's tons of visitation, 4 million people in Yellowstone. I think even a little bit more than that in Grand Teton. And then Yukon Charlie, who sees hardly any visitors at all, people who have to work really hard to get in there, either by boat or by plane or something. And then the Midwest Park, and it spanned all of the different, each park has something very unique about it, but they're all Canis lupus living there.
I love that.
And in the end, I think we ended up having, if you total up all of the years of data collection for all the parks together, it was 118 years and almost 200 packs.
Man, that's incredible. It's so wild to think about that. And listen, hopefully you're right. This spawns more collaboration for all of you, because you guys can do it together, and you've already done it once before. I feel like the first time is always the toughest, and then you can just, like you say, springboard off and say, hey, we want to do another big project. And you're right. Always want to get more people to these other national parks. Like you say, Yellowstone, Denali, I think to a degree, Grand Teton, they all have like the notoriety, but just getting these other parks in there is a huge, huge win, I think, for everyone who listens, who's listening to this, reading your guys' research and like, oh, I'm going to take a trip to one of these parks that I've never either maybe not knew about, and then I know that I could possibly see wolves or something like that.
Yeah.
So getting into this for you guys, because you spoke about human-caused mortality, and I think, what can you speak to that you all found out? Because I think when people hear human-caused mortality, they immediately, I think, believe, hunting and that type. Mm. Did it cover all types of mortality? Because I know wolves have been killed by car. Did the percentages lead to any sort of a different conclusion than what you guys were looking for? Or was it all grouped together and that's how you were able to come to the numbers and how they were affected? We'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah. So the first research question in this paper is actually just, what is the extent of human-caused mortality for wolves that are primarily using the parks for their territories and home and movements. These didn't count wolves that live outside the park or are outside of the park. 70% of the time. There was quite a bit of transboundary movement in some of the smaller parks. In Yellowstone, the wolves that we track here generally are only out of the park boundaries about 4 or 5% of the time.
Right.
So primarily in Yellowstone, Denali is pretty close to that. But Grand Teton and Voyagers, they're moving outside of the park quite a lot, maybe up to 40, 45% of their time. And so there's a lot of transboundary movements there. As you would expect, they had a little bit higher of a percentage of human-caused mortality. And so that was pretty highly correlated, how much time they spent outside the park and the percent of human-caused mortality. So we compared natural mortality to human-caused mortality. And if you lump all the mortalities from all the parks together, it ended up that 36% of the wolves died of a human cause. And yeah, the first thing people think in those cases is things like hunting seasons. But that wasn't the only cause. It was a combination of 5 different things: hunting seasons, so legal harvests, poaching, lethal control, vehicle strikes, and then also there were a handful of capture mortalities. Those were, most of them years and years ago, as they were kind of working out how to even capture wolves and study them, and it's extremely rare. I think there was 8 total out of all of those, 118 years worth of study, most of them a couple decades prior. And so that's pretty rare. Mostly it was that harvest, lethal control, poaching, and vehicle strikes. Slightly different combinations for each of the parks, because there are different things going on, not only in each of the parks, but also on the boundaries of each park.
Right.
And so in some of the years, wolves were protected under the endangered species list. So there was no hunting season. And then some of the years there were hunting seasons around the boundaries of the park. In a place like Alaska, they were never listed as, they've never been endangered.
They've never been listed, right? Yeah.
So there's been hunting and also lethal control, usually dealing with things like trying to help out caribou herds and things like that, where the wolf population is purposely lowered around the boundaries of like Yukon Charlie. Grand Teton National Park had a pretty even breakdown of those 4 causes. They had a little bit higher of a percent of vehicle strikes. There are a couple of highways that go through that park that have higher speed limits than most other parks. I was kind of surprised I think it was over 30 years worth of data from Denali. They never had a single wolf hit by a car in the park.
Wow.
And that was pretty rare in Yellowstone. I think there was like one a year for over a decade. And for people who've been to Denali before, it might make sense. Most of the park is only accessible through getting on the shuttle buses. And so it's Park Service employees that are driving those shuttle buses. And so you can't drive most of the park just in your personal vehicle. I think it's only the first 15 miles or so. That made sense. Yellowstone is accessible through people's personal vehicles, however many couple hundred miles throughout Yellowstone. So there is a bit more vehicle strike going on there compared to and Yukon Charlie, there's none because there's no roads.
There's no roads. Yeah. You either got to fly or swim, basically. It's how you're going to get there.
So again, really interesting that each park had its kind of unique character and different things that wolves have to deal with in their life. Yet the second research question that we looked at was what I alluded to earlier, how those human-caused mortalities then play out for the pack, whether they persist, whether they reproduce the next year. And surprisingly, each one of the parks had a very similar percent once we divided up packs into those that had only natural cause mortality and those packs that had at least one human cause mortality, and we compared their persistence and reproduction rates, essentially. Surprisingly, they were all very similar. Packs that had only natural cause mortality were very likely to persist. It was usually in the 90% range. 9 out of 10 times a pack is going to still be around from April 1st of one year to March 31st of the next year. But it's not 100% of the time. Sometimes packs dissolve, when they only have natural mortality. It's something that happens occasionally. We will have about 1 pack dissolve and 1 new pack form each year on average in Yellowstone, which makes sense because we track about 10 packs. So 9 out of 10.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then for those packs that had human caused mortalities, at least one, their percent drops. Their percent of persistence and reproduction drops. And that is a significant difference when you compare those 2 proportions. I think it was about averaged 76% of the time. So going from about 92% of the time persistence with only natural cause mortality, and then dropping down to 76%. So 16% difference for all of the parks lumped together. Some of the parks had a bigger difference than others, but they were all significantly different from each other.
Yeah.
So even though wolves are dealing with different things in each one of the parks, they were all kind of responding to human-caused mortality in a way that was statistically the same.
Why do you think, and I don't know if you guys delved into it as much or if it was just putting the research out there, what do you think the cause of the packs not surviving as much as with natural? Because people all know, obviously, the game that they hunt, pack dynamics, fighting other packs and things like that, those obviously contribute to a natural death in the wild. What do you think the difference is? Is there something that you guys looked at? Was it the behavior of the pack? Was it the animals that were taken? I think there was something in there too about if there's the lead pair, the alpha pair, if one of those wolves is killed or dies. Obviously, I think in any situation, the pack has less of a shot to survive because that's where all the teaching comes from. But what did you guys see, if there was any reasoning as to why human caused has such a big drop as opposed to natural cause mortality?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some of this is just simply a numbers game. You know, when a pack has
Got it.
10 members and 2 of them die, the chances that there's someone that can take on that leadership position in the 8 that are left is maybe pretty good. But if 4 of them die, then the chances that someone can take on that leadership and get them through that kind of unstable time is just a little bit lower. So it's just kind of numbers.
Numbers game.
Human-caused mortality, in some cases, I don't think this happens in all cases, but in some cases, is not completely compensatory. And so it is a little bit additive. You know, the wolf would have otherwise lived through the year had it not been killed by a human. In some cases, it probably is compensatory, where a certain number of wolves that are killed by people would have probably died during that same year anyway. But human-caused mortality for some of these places, especially Yukon Charlie and in Yellowstone for a couple of years at least, it exceeded what you would normally see for the mortality rate if we just had natural. And so it's kind of in addition to natural mortality in some cases. Also, I would like to look at this a little bit more in the future. So this is just kind of like a hypothesis, but it does seem like human-caused mortality, there might be something about human-caused mortality that is a little bit more disruptive to a wolf pack. And some of those things might be that they are more likely to occur in kind of clusters. So a pack only experiencing natural mortality is almost never going to have more than 1 death in a day, or even 1 death in a couple of weeks. So they can kind of deal with one at a time. But a pack that has human-caused mortality, especially things like, you know, hunting and lethal control, even vehicle strikes occasionally will come in these kind of clusters where there'll be more than 1 in a day or more than 1 in a couple of weeks. And I think if you can imagine if a human family was dealing with the loss of a family member, you know, dealing with 1 is hard enough. If you were dealing with 2 at the same time, or 2 kind of back to back with each other, it would be kind of this compounding problem that maybe would be, you know, your family would be less likely to be able to recover from such a thing. It's very similar with wolf families. You know, they're out there in very similar types of social groups, dealing with very similar problems, getting food, protecting themselves from each other, or, you know, their other neighboring packs and things. And so that is probably part of it. There are probably also some cases where wolf human-caused deaths happen at certain times of the year that might be a little bit more disruptive for a pack, such as during pregnancy.
Breeding season, yeah.
Yeah, breeding season is already pretty chaotic for wolves, even humans aside. But add humans to that, if a female wolf has bred already and she's pregnant, and that one is one of them that is killed by a human cause, the pack doesn't have another chance to produce pups until a whole nother year. And for wolves, that's a really long time. They don't live that long to begin with, 3 or 4 years on average in these protected areas. And so there's no guarantee they're even going to make it a year.
Right. And you're just compounding it on top of that. Because like you said, if that female is taken, whatever size that litter is, those pups are obviously taken with her. And now, like you say, now you have to go through the whole calendar year. You're talking about natural cause, you're talking about packs fighting with each other, looking for food, disease. I mean, I know there's not that many diseases running through packs at this moment, but something can always spring up, I'm sure. So yeah, it's just another compounding issue, I think, that they have to face, right?
Yeah. And it's kind of amazing when you know how much that they could potentially have to deal with in just a single year of their life. Getting food alone sounds hard, trying to take down a bison with just your teeth and your friends. The Molly's pack just recently turned 28 years old. They're the pack with the longest reign in Yellowstone, and it's kind of incredible to think that they've been able to persist through, I think it's now about 7 generations. And this idea of pack lineages, going back to what Gordon Haber was talking about decades ago, um, it's something that I find really fascinating, and I think other people do too. Even people who, might not be all that interested in like having a bunch of wolves in an area. That's that kind of like population level interest. Pack level stuff is so parallel to how we live. I think it's always kind of this fascinating dynamic, and it could come into play. It could end up being hopefully something that is helpful for people that are making decisions about wolves throughout the world. If you have a ranch and you have a pack living there that isn't causing any problems, people have talked about this quite a lot for the last couple of decades. If you have a pair that's there raising pups, not causing any problems, then it's better to keep that pair there and keep that lineage going because they are not causing any issues with livestock. And hopefully they're teaching their pups to only go after live prey. That's kind of, each pack has its own traditions, and we know that they learn a lot through watching their elders. And socially mediated learning is actually just another word for culture. And so they each kind of have their own culture. If a pack starts doing something like killing livestock, then that is a scenario where, yeah, we don't want that lineage to continue. We don't want that culture to continue. That's causing people a lot of problems. And so, if you have that lineage that's actually working well for the wolves and for people, then we want to cultivate that. It doesn't really happen that much for the national parks because we don't have livestock in them.
Right.
But we see this happen when we're watching wolves. We see packs go after certain types of prey. Some packs are more likely to go after bison than others. Some of them use the same den year after year after year, even sometimes in the same order, start with this den and then move to this den. Other ones will move much more often or have a bunch of different options and will choose a different one each year. And so it's really fascinating to watch, especially having watched this long, because now I started in 2007 as a technician and spent a lot of time in the field. And it's really cool to kind of see certain lineages that have persisted and other ones that have blinked out and start to think about why that might be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point that you make there because, like you said, it's very correlated to humans, right? Because we learn, if I'm learning a recipe, I get that handed down from, my ancestors of how they cook certain things or whatever it is. And it's a simple way of looking at it. But you're right. And we've spoken to, yourself and a bunch of other biologists, former biologists, the Carter Niemeyers of the world. And it's really interesting when you look at the pack dynamic that if you see that they're not a troubled pack, meaning that they're having an impact on humans, like you say, better to leave them left alone. And that's the majority. I think it's something like an 80-20 split. It's pretty vast in terms of, problem, if you want to call it problem wolves.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's not kind of what we're getting into, but yeah, it's a good point that you bring up. I was just seeing something in the article here that it looks like Voyagers, and I know Voyagers is very uniquely shaped, sorry. In the way the boundaries are. And it seemed as though they're the ones that had the most, they cross the boundary of the park and into, federal or whatever, public land,
Yep.
more so than any others. And they were the ones that seemed to have the most run-ins with that. Did you guys find it was mostly, like, what was another factor that you guys saw? Is it mostly the where the park is situated, depending upon Denali, Grand Teton, whatever it is, and the access to humans? I know it's probably a silly question, but, like you say, Denali hasn't had any car strikes simply because you can't access that road.
Mm-hmm.
So why Voyagers? Were you able to pinpoint why Voyagers? Is it just literally because of the way that it's situated and the boundaries, or was there something else that came up when you guys were looking at why they have more human-caused mortality, I guess, than most?
So Voyagers, it had the smallest number of uh, data points. And so percentages can be a little bit
Got
tricky when
it.
you start to compare Voyagers that only
It's a
had
good point.
9 human caused mortalities, and Yukon Charlie had 158. So it could
Oh, wow.
easily
Okay.
change
Yeah.
another few years of research out of Voyagers, and maybe those percentages look a bit different. Um, but also
Hmm.
to your point about parks boundaries, uh, many of them are not drawn along kind of ecological changes. So, a river or a ridge line or something, they're just kind of drawn in a straight line through a watershed, maybe.
Right.
Yellowstone is a really good
Right.
example of this. The original drawing was simply a rectangle around all of the thermal features. And, um, you know, early explorers, European explorers to this area who were thinking about this national park potential here, it wasn't because of the wildlife, even though Yellowstone is really known as a wildlife centric park. It was due to all of the thermal features. It was the one thing that people, European settlers coming out here and explorers hadn't seen before. And they'd probably seen a ton of wildlife on their way out here through the prairie, through the lower Missouri River
Right.
basin, probably more wildlife, to be honest. And then when they got to Yellowstone, it was kind of like, yeah, there's still wildlife here, but there's also these crazy hot springs and geysers and everything. And so drawing that rectangle now, within a couple of decades after designation, there were some land trades so that some of the boundary, especially the east boundary with Wyoming, has been drawn to kind of better follow some ecological shifts, along the top of a ridge line, for example. So one watershed is in Yellowstone and the other watershed is in, well, it's US Forest Service land, but in Wyoming. And so that helps a bit, but there are many places where it still is just a straight line, likely will always be just a straight line. So it's something that we have to deal with because it makes it harder. Of course, the animals don't know where the boundary line is. And when there are different
Right.
agencies managing under different goals and different mandates on one side of a boundary line versus the other, then it becomes, all of a sudden we have to deal with a lot more transboundary issues, which just means a lot more compromise and negotiation, really trying to get those two mandates, those two goals to, trying to not to get them to overlap each other necessarily, because I don't think that that's possible, but
Right.
to find a compromise in the area that's right along the boundary.
Got it. And when you guys are collaborating on this, is there is there a thought to continue the collaboration because of the numbers that you guys found out? Is this going to be one of these papers that you guys are gonna put addendums to, or there's gonna be another research paper maybe in the future to look at this in 5 or 10 years? Have you guys not even looked that far in advance? Is this one of those things where you guys go, wow, we put this together pretty quick, and so you know how to do it, and this could be something that's a yearly update? I don't know what you guys are thinking in that because of the collaboration and how well it worked. Is this one of those where you're gonna get a paper yearly or every couple of years? What do you think about that, or was there even a consensus among all of you about that?
I think that this, like a lot of big science projects, we feel like we answered a couple questions and came up with about a dozen more
That sounds about
new
right. Yeah.
ones. Um, the big one is comparing natural cause mortality to human cause mortality.
Hmm.
And even though we did that with the raw data in this paper, we didn't do the predicted probabilities for natural cause mortality only, except for lumping them all together in this. If people are going to look at the paper, which would be amazing, the predicted figure 3, the black line at the top, is packs with only natural cause mortalities. And so, but I'd like to look at that in more detail. What is one loss versus two losses? Why isn't it closer to 100%? Some people might ask, and how low does it get? And what does the raw data say about the rate of natural mortality versus human caused mortality? How much is it additive versus compensatory? That's Some people have tried to answer that with other research projects in the past, and it is very difficult, especially when you just have study areas as opposed to entire populations that you're looking at. And so, yeah, I think there's a whole world of questions to look at next.
Yeah.
But I am hoping that this paper can be used, if anyone is looking at a wolf population in a certain area and kind of average pack sizes, you can go to the figures in this paper and say, okay, if our average pack size is 8, we would expect them to persist at about 92 point, 0.92 proportion of their time. And then if they lose one wolf, it's this. If they lose 2 wolves, it's this proportion. It drops a little bit. The drops are actually pretty small for big packs, especially. And while other papers have shown that populations are super resilient to human-caused mortality, this paper does show that large packs are very resilient to human-caused mortality as well at this pack level. So these lineages can persist even with a decent amount of loss. We saw this with the Junction Butte pack last year. They went into the hunting season with 28 wolves. They did leave the park a handful of times and had 8 of their pack members harvested in Montana. And so they ended the hunting season with 17 pack members. A few others disappeared, a few others dispersed. And they're still around. They ended up having 4 litters. They're a big pack again. I think they're about 25 this year. And they were marked as persisted and reproduced in this data set, or in our data sets. And all 8 of those harvests that they had were either pups or yearlings. I think there was 1 2-year-old. That becomes really important because had they lost any of their leaders or any of their elderly wolves, maybe they would have dissolved, but it's a huge pack anyway. And so they can really pull together. Another wolf is going to take on that leadership position. It would be really hard for a pack of that many to dissolve. I think they would have to endure quite a lot of human-caused mortality, as opposed to a very small pack that maybe there's only 4 of them. Their chances of making it from one year to the next are about 8 out of 10 times. And then they lose 2 or 3 wolves, and their probability of making it through the year does go down, but it's about 10% per each wolf. And so in trying to explain this paper to people, I've kind of struggled because anytime you talk about the percent of something happening going down, it makes it sound really bad. But I think it is important to realize that if the difference is about 8 out of times they make it, and then they lose a wolf, and it's 7 out of times they make it, that does show how resilient they are. It's harder for the littler packs than it is for the big packs, and it's harder for packs that lose a leader versus only losing, say, a pup or a yearling or something. But it's kind of heartwarming to see how resilient they are, even in places where humans are having a pretty heavy hand.
Yeah, it seems that way. And that was actually, it was leading into my next question. You kind of answered it. Is really what you want anyone who's going to read, because we're going to post the paper in the description so that people can obviously, we want everyone to read this paper. We want, the continued conversation. What do you want them to get out of this? I mean, I'm sure, maybe some of the other co-authors want, certain things that they would say. But for you personally, what's the thing that you're looking at that you want the community at large or people who are interested in wolves, when they look at this, to get out of it? Or at least what's the driving point that you would say, if you look at this paper, here's what you would want them to understand so that it's maybe not so jarring, or that they can understand a little bit better? What do you think that would be?
I would say that taking a couple of steps back from the paper and kind of looking at human impacts on wildlife species worldwide, I think that it's important. We have a responsibility to understand how we impact the world and other species. And I think that we don't have to view our impacts or influences on other species as like a critique or a criticism that we can't handle. I think we can take it. It's our responsibility to understand it. It doesn't mean that there's not an implication that it's like, we are bad, we can't do this, we shouldn't be on the planet kind of thing. That's taking it way too far. I think we have to understand our impact and then use that information to, you know, we get to decide how many animals are on this planet. That's the reality of where we are in the Anthropocene, really. And so right now we have good information about wolf populations. We have decent information about individual wolves. There are kind of guiding, sometimes laws and regulations, sometimes ethics that are understood. We're not allowed to torture animals. We're not allowed to, people have to check their traps at certain times. There are kind of guidelines on how to treat individuals and how to treat packs, how to treat populations. But there aren't really guiding principles or regulations on how we view packs and lineages. Some species, people kind of understand this a little bit better, where there are efforts to preserve things like migration routes or sex ratios, say in an ungulate species like a moose or an elk or something, to try and kind of maintain the integrity of a different scale other than populations. And I think that is what we're doing here with wolves. It's just another scale other than populations that we should consider in things like science and management. And hopefully will allow people to fulfill management goals in a way that's just better informed. And as far as the public, if people are listening to this and they go and find the paper, I think just that would be at the top of my list, understanding that we have impacts on other species. We should try to understand them. And then also this pack level way of looking at another species, kind of at the way they see the world, is going to be beneficial, not only for them, but for us as well. A wolf in Yellowstone, I was just telling someone this kind of same, kind of playing out the same story. A wolf in Yellowstone doesn't care that there's 107 other wolves currently in the park. But they do care, does my family have enough pack members, enough skill, enough experience to do the things we need to do, to hunt large prey, to protect ourselves, to figure out where to cross the Yellowstone River where it's safe, whoever has that experience. Avoid thermal areas, not mess with that bear, but pester that bear because we can bully that one around. And so that's kind of how they're looking at the world through this: is my family good and am I good? Not at the population level. And so just trying to see the world a little bit more through their eyes, I think it would be kind of a nice way of approaching their science and management from kind of their angle.
Yeah. I think if you get into the, like you say, it's almost, you zoom in a little bit and you see how they're able to survive and how they've survived this whole time, even through everything that humans have done to them. I think your point is very well taken. I think I just have one or two more things. What's the future? Like you said, I mean, you've already laid out, obviously wolves are resilient. The packs are resilient. Some dissolve and it happens. What do you think in the general scope? Did you all come to a conclusion, or is this still to be determined, the future of wolves in all of these parks? Is it really going to come down to collaboration with other bodies to make sure that, like you were saying just before, that we find really a common ground or a middle ground that is suitable for everyone, including the wolves? Because again, as we've all said, the wolves don't really give two hoots. What else is going on around them other than, like you say, is my pack safe? Can we get food? Do we have a place to den? Things like that. So if you can answer that, what's the thing that you guys either came to, or what do you think, even personally, future wise?
Yeah, I think so it's kind of different for every location because
right.
Each park has different neighbors that have there are different agencies that have different goals, different relationships with those neighbors, and different levels of collaboration that are needed or necessary. Sometimes there's a lot, sometimes there's less so. And so it's kind of up to each location. I think this is the value of flexibility in management, having kind of small scale management as well, as opposed to something that applies to the entire Park Service or something that applies to the entire Northern Rockies or something. I much prefer there to be flexibility, sometimes year to year and along different shared boundaries so that we can deal with this here. That also allows for a bit more compromise. We can maybe do this in this section and have this different other kind of a management approach in this other section. And so, yeah, I think hopefully the paper gives people the information that helps them make some of those decisions. But each park and each agency that deals with wolves at all gets to kind of make whatever they decide to do, as long as it's science-based. I mean, I think that would be the ultimate goal. In the Park Service, the paper found that only about 7% of total mortality happened 7% of total mortality came from humans while in the boundaries of the park. A lot of that was vehicle strikes. And then a handful of, problem wolves in Yellowstone. There were 2 that were deemed human safety threats because they were extremely habituated and running up to people and had to be killed. This was a number of years ago. We haven't had that happen since 2011. And then a couple of other poaching cases and things. And so there are things that, as the Park Service, we wrote about in the paper, talking about maybe there are some places where we can talk about crossing structures or lowering speed limits. This doesn't, of course, just deal with wolves. Every animal that lives in the park is sometimes being hit and killed by vehicle strikes. And some of those places are well known. That's not just a wolf strike area. It's all of the animals that are there. And so we can, start to think about how we can lower the numbers. I don't think that 0 human caused mortalities is a reasonable goal for anywhere, even inside a national park, because accidents do happen. Even if there was a slow speed limits and perfectly placed crossing structures, occasionally there'll be a wolf hit by a car or a wolf that becomes habituated and needs to be removed, or, deals with bothers livestock or something outside the park and needs to be removed. So 0% human caused mortality is not going to be a reasonable goal, but I think we can have it be a little bit lower in places where that's part of the goal, part of the mandate, really, for that agency. In other places, that part of the goal is to lower wolf populations. And maybe this paper can be helpful in some ways for those people too. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I hope it is too. It seems like the collaboration is working. Kira, where can everybody find it? I'm going to have it in the description, but just tell everyone if they're looking for the paper. Obviously, it's free access, which is really, really important. So just tell everyone where they can find the paper.
Yeah. So the journal is Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, and it would just be in some of the first page, the very current research communications for the February issue. It is in open or early view right now, so the hard copy is not quite out yet for those people who are members and subscribe to that journal. Or people can just Google the title of the paper, which is Human Caused Mortality Triggers Pack Instability in Gray Wolves. And it should be fairly easy to find there. I've also posted it on, I think, my Twitter page and Instagram, which should just be Kira_Cassidy. People can find it through my link tree there. And then maybe in the show notes for here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to have all that stuff there. If you guys aren't following Kira on Instagram, highly recommend it. She posts all of her research, wonderful photos. She does some great art too. Kira, it's always a pleasure to have you back on. You'll continue to make waves as the 4th and 5th appearance on these shows as we go down the line. But again, thank you for giving us your time and really just telling everybody what to look for in this paper. And obviously we'll have you back on again soon with whatever else is coming down the pike because you guys are always figuring out new stuff. So I really appreciate you again, just giving the time and sharing this stuff.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah, you got it. Just stick around for a minute just so I can wrap up some things. How's to you all out there? And I will be back with you next time, hopefully with Steven. Bye, everybody.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.